Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. You guys sent us down a fascinating path this time. We're talking pyramids, specifically the Giza pyramids.
And we're not just talking about, like, the basics here.
No, no. You guys sent in some really intriguing, some might even say controversial research.
Right.
And our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to dive deep into a YouTube conference transcript. This transcript is dense, it's detailed, but it features some of the big names in, well, alternative Egyptology, I guess we could call it. We're talking Armando Mei
Filippo Biondi,
and, of course, Corrado Malanga.
a trio of heavy hitters.
Yeah.
Now, this deep dive, it promises to be a real head-scratcher. They're presenting some findings that could potentially rewrite, well, history as we know it.
No pressure, right. So the transcript we're looking at, it comes from a YouTube video titled, and forgive my pronunciation, O Conferenza, #Giza le piramidi e le porta al tempo. Basically, conference, Giza the pyramids, and the door of time.
Catchy, right?
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't click on that? But in all seriousness, these researchers, they're presenting their findings on the Giza complex, really diving deep into the internal structures of the pyramids. And get this, proposing a completely different age for the site.
We're not talking about slightly older, like, oh, a few hundred years. We're talking a dating that throws the whole conventional timeline out the window.
Right, like way, way back. So let's get into the good stuff. Right off the bat, they talk about anomalies found inside the pyramids. I mean, not just, weird markings or anything, but like actual evidence of forced entry.
Into places that supposedly were sealed off for millennia. And on top of that, they're proposing a dating for the complex based on celestial alignments.
Around 36,400 BC.
Yeah. Think about that for a second. If these pyramids are that old, well, we need to rethink everything.
Human history, the capabilities of ancient civilizations. I mean, it's a paradigm shift, right?
Absolutely. So the transcript, it starts with their exploration of the Queen's Chamber North Duct and the Great Pyramid. They're talking about finding fragments, like pieces of something on the floor and scratches on the opposite wall. Immediately you're thinking forced entry, right?
I mean, someone got in there. And it wasn't just like a quick peek either. They compared this to another area, the Cavillia duct in the King's Chamber entrance passage, and they found a similar situation there. But where things get really interesting, and this is for like the real pyramid enthusiasts out there, is further in the Queen's Chamber North Duct, they found a more significant breach, like something really got in there. Again, debris indicating forced entry around the 9th block.
Okay, so we've got evidence of forced entry, but here's the kicker. Inside that debris, they found some things that definitely don't belong in an ancient Egyptian pyramid.
Like what? Spill the beans.
Okay, so picture this. A ticket from the Giza archaeological area dated between 1973 and 1991, and a piece of movie film. Russian-made movie film, to be precise. I'm talking about out-of-place artifacts, right? This wasn't some ancient scroll or tool. This was like evidence of relatively recent activity, and probably unauthorized entry into this really confined space.
Yeah, you don't just stumble upon Russian movie film from the 70s in a sealed pyramid chamber. I mean,
Yes.
it would be like, I don't know, finding a smartphone in a Viking longboat. Totally out of place. But there's something even more interesting here, especially for our listeners who've been following Corrado and Filippo's work.
Lay it on us.
The location of this forced entry, this recent breach, it aligns almost perfectly with a specific chamber in their reconstruction of the pyramid's interior. You know, the one they've been talking about, the green-colored chamber.
So it's not just an anomaly. It's like their technology is being validated in real time. They're seeing something that we're now finding physical evidence of. And that's huge. Gives their whole research approach some serious weight,
Okay, so they're obviously using some pretty sophisticated technology techniques to kind of, I guess, look inside these pyramids without actually, digging them up. How are they doing this? Well, the transcript gets into the Khafre project. And this is where Armando Mei's work on dating the site, it becomes really important. He's building on Robert Bauval's Orion correlation theory, but he's going way beyond just the 3 main pyramids and the Sphinx.
He's like taking the whole Giza plateau and throwing it into the mix.
Exactly. He's looking at the mastaba of Khafre I, Mensi II, the temple of Amenhotep II, even temples at the foot of the Sphinx. He's analyzing the celestial alignment of all these structures.
And what he's found, it's mind-blowing. He's proposing that Zep Tepi.
Zep Tepi!
Yeah, the first time in ancient Egyptian cosmology, the sort of mythical golden age,
Yeah.
that it actually occurred around, wait for it, 36,400 BC.
36,400 BC. I mean, that's That's tens of thousands of years older than the timeline we're taught in school.
Right. So if the Giza complex is really that old, we've got to ask ourselves, who built this? And more importantly, how did they think?
That's a great question. And the researchers, they try to get into the mindset of these builders. They even use the phrase mind of the serial killer.
Oh, hold on. Serial killer.
Yeah, I know it sounds intense. But they're not talking literally, of course. They're talking about trying to decipher the intentions behind these massive structures, the architecture, the engineering, and especially how they might have communicated, knowledge through these monuments.
It's like they're treating the pyramids as a giant puzzle.
And a particularly interesting piece of this puzzle, or I guess the lack of a piece, is the absence of hieroglyphs inside the Giza pyramids.
I mean, you think about all the hieroglyphs we see in tombs and temples.
Right. But in the pyramids themselves, especially the big ones, there's nothing.
And the researchers, they even dismissed the Zed graffiti in the Great Pyramid as a known forgery.
Yeah. So if they weren't using hieroglyphs, how are they communicating? Their proposal is fascinating. The language of number.
Okay, language of number. What does that even mean?
They're suggesting that mathematics, numerical relationships, these could have been a universal language, something that transcended spoken language.
So like a universal code embedded in the architecture.
Potentially. I mean,
Yeah.
It's a radical idea, but it kind of makes you look at these structures in a whole new way.
It's not just about the size and the scale anymore. It's about like the math, the proportions, the relationships between different elements. There could be like a hidden message, a code, right there in front of us.
And this is where astronomy comes into play too, not just in dating the site, but also in understanding how the pyramids might connect to what they call the underworld.
This gets into some pretty deep stuff. The ancient beliefs about the cosmos, the idea of a cosmic order reflected in these earthly structures.
So we've got a potential new dating, we've got this language of number, and then the transcript takes a turn and starts talking about geological evidence found on the Great Pyramid.
Geological, like rocks and stuff.
Well, yeah. More specifically, they describe traces of water erosion on certain blocks, on the northern facade and the northwest corner particularly. And they're not just talking about like normal weathering, they're talking about signs of actual water submersion.
Okay, hold on. Water submersion, like the pyramid was underwater.
That's what they're suggesting.
Yeah.
And if we connect this back to Robert Bauval's alignment time frame around 10,500 BC, the researchers are saying that this erosion might date back to that period. Maybe part of the pyramid's outer covering was removed around then, exposing these blocks to water.
So we're talking about like a cataclysmic event, a flood.
Potentially. And it's not all just rough, eroded stone either. They also describe this perfectly worked, perfectly aligned limestone pavement on the east side of the Great Pyramid. These are massive blocks cut and fitted together with incredible precision.
Okay, so on one hand, we've got signs of like massive water damage. And then right next to it, perfectly pristine stonework.
Yeah, it's a puzzle, isn't it? But that pavement, those massive blocks, they become important later when we start talking about the pyramid's base.
Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's move inside, literally inside the Great Pyramid. The transcript, it starts talking about some interesting obstructions, like things blocking passages.
At the top of the ascending passage, the one that leads up to the Grand Gallery, they found a granite block blocking a hole. And this aligns with Corrado and Filippo's reconstruction.
The green chamber thing.
Yeah, exactly. But there's more. There's another granite block, this time blocking an opening at the highest point on the east wall of the Grand Gallery, again leading to another chamber that they had reconstructed earlier. It's almost like their internal map is being confirmed physically.
Like someone's going in and like checking off the boxes, Yep, granite block here. Yep, another one there.
And perhaps the most intriguing of all, they talk about the King's Chamber. There's this wall built in the 1980s, apparently. Information from custodians suggests that behind this wall there's a descending corridor. And this corridor, it splits. One passage goes up, possibly connecting to, the area we were talking about, accessible from the Queen's Chamber North Duct. The other goes down to a well.
So they're saying there's like a hidden network of passages inside the Great Pyramid, and that the recent break-in, the one with the movie film, that might have been a way to get into this concealed area from above.
It's a real mystery, isn't it? Like, who went in there? What were they looking for? Why seal it back up?
Spooky stuff. Okay, so the transcript then moves on to the Pyramid of Khafre. And they point out right away that the internal layout is different. It's not like the Great Pyramid.
Different how?
Well, for one, there's this niche at the end of the descending passage, right opposite the entrance to the second known chamber. And this niche, it was a bit of a roadblock for the researchers.
Oh, block.
Literally. That's where the Scam Pyramids project had their equipment set up. So the researchers couldn't get in there to explore.
And, there were concerns about potential damage, like what happened in the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid with the drilling. It seems like some people are worried that, muon detection efforts might be physically altering these ancient structures.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. I mean, we're talking about incredibly delicate, incredibly ancient sites. We don't want to be, damaging them in the name of research.
Agreed. So they couldn't explore that niche, but they did find something interesting in the horizontal passage leading to Bolzoni's chamber, this uniquely shaped block on the left wall. It looks different, like it might be hiding something, another passage maybe.
It's like those hidden doors in old houses, You push on a specific book on the shelf and boom, a secret passageway.
Exactly. And further along, they found another niche. This one with a pink granite block obstructing a sandstone block. The fact that they use different materials here, it suggests like a deliberate concealment, right?
Like they were trying to hide something specific.
Right. And speaking of Bolzoni's chamber, the transcript talks about their entry into this chamber, 207 years after its discovery on March 2nd, 2025. And what did they find? Well, 2 corresponding shafts on opposite walls, and evidence that suggests there might have been 2 more that were sealed off.
This is a big difference from the Great Pyramid, where the king's and queen's chambers only have 1 pair of shafts each. So what were these extra shafts for? Why were they sealed? More mysteries.
And before we move on from Khafre, the transcript mentions these cracks they found in the northeast area near the base. They're saying these could indicate internal collapses.
Like there are voids, empty spaces within the pyramid that we don't even know about.
Right. So more potential for unexplored areas waiting to be discovered. Okay, so we've talked about the Great Pyramid, we've talked about Khafre. Let's shift our focus to the Valley Temple, the one near the Sphinx.
Okay, the Valley Temple. Now, the researchers, they have some interesting things to say about this structure. First of all, they highlight its dual nature. On the outside, you've got this eroded sandstone, but inside, it's all granite.
Like a shell of sandstone and a core of granite.
Yeah, exactly. And this makes them question the traditional attribution of the Valley Temple to Pharaoh Khafre. They point out that this attribution is mainly based on a statue of Khafre found, get this, upside down in a well.
Upside down? That's weird.
Right. Not exactly the most compelling evidence, but what really gets them going is the size and precision of the granite blocks inside. I mean, we're talking 70 to 80 tons.
Huge.
Precise cuts, curved joins. The researchers are saying that this level of technology, it just doesn't fit with what we typically associate with the Fourth Dynasty.
So they're suggesting it might be older.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And the shape of the Valley Temple, it also has them intrigued. They describe it as looking like an electrical plate or a microchip.
Okay, that's an interesting comparison.
Right, it makes you think, what was the real purpose of this structure?
Yeah.
And this leads them to analyze some of the simpler visual elements. Like there's this 3-pronged shape, which they link to the number 3.
Okay.
And there are 16 base columns.
16.
Right. But if you add the digits of 16, you get 7. And then there's a niche representing the number 1. So they've got this sequence 3, 7, 1.
3, 7, 1. What about it?
Well, they see this as a potential anagram for 137.
137.
Which in physics is a pretty significant number. It relates to the fine structure constant.
Yeah, and then they get into the symbolism.
Right. So they connect the number 3 and its shape in the temple to the Hebrew letter Shin, which represents rebirth, like a man incarnating.
Yeah.
And the number 1 and its shape to Tau, symbolizing a reincarnated king, the completion of a great work. It's like there's a whole hidden language encoded in the design.
Okay, so we've got potential new dating, we've got the language of number, we've got this geological evidence, and now the transcript takes a turn into even more, shall we say, esoteric territory. They start talking about the emerald tablets.
Ah, yes, the emerald tablets. I mean, how could we not talk about those?
I know, right? But to be fair, the researchers do acknowledge that these tablets aren't exactly considered academically reliable. I mean, there's no original text.
Right. They're basically working with translations of translations.
But they're not focusing on like the whole mystical aspect of the tablets. They're interested in the descriptions of the city of Amenti, and they believe that these descriptions might hold some actual historical clues that could potentially align with archaeological
It's
findings.
like they're trying to separate the myth from the potential reality.
Exactly. And this is where it gets, well, kind of fun. They start analyzing phrases from the tablets, phrases that seem like gibberish at first glance, like Mekamela Kish Talat Uru.
Okay, that definitely sounds like gibberish.
But what they do is they break these phrases down into syllables. And get this, they start finding phonetic similarities to Mesopotamian, Sumerian, and Proto-Semitic languages.
So, like, these ancient languages are, like, echoing through the emerald tablets.
Potentially. And it gets better. The tablets describe these infinite underground spaces reach through passages or doors, and the researchers, they immediately connect this to the SAR findings, the radar data that shows those extensive subsurface structures.
So, like, the emerald tablets are describing, like, a real physical place.
And remember all those wells on the Giza Plateau? The non-dynastic ones? Well, the tablets mention deep wells in Amenti. Could be a connection there. And then they bring in the whole Egyptian afterlife concept. Amenti, the underworld, Rostau, the surface of Giza, and Duat, the celestial realm. And this ties back into the as above, so below principle, often linked to Thoth.
It's like they're saying, to understand the pyramids, you need to look at the entire Giza complex, from east to west, from the surface to the depths below. The Sphinx, Amenti, the journey through the underworld, it's all connected.
It's a whole different way of looking at these structures, isn't it? Not just as tombs, but as gateways, maybe even like machines.
Machines. Okay, now you're really getting into it. But you're right. The transcript does take a turn towards, well, technology. They start talking about spatial sonar.
Spatial sonar.
Yeah. Now, this term is a little provocative because, sound doesn't really travel in space. But what they're actually talking about is a really clever application of satellite-based synthetic aperture radar. SAR. SAR. Okay, so for our listeners who aren't familiar, can you give us like a quick rundown of how SAR works?
Sure. Basically, SAR uses radar mounted on satellites. These satellites, they're orbiting the Earth hundreds of kilometers up.
Yeah.
And they send out these electromagnetic waves, pulses of energy, and then they listen for the echoes that bounce back.
So like a bat using echolocation. Exactly. But instead of sound waves, they're using radar waves.
Yeah.
And by analyzing those echoes, those reflections, they can create incredibly detailed images of the ground, even through clouds and vegetation.
Okay, that's pretty cool. But I imagine there are some challenges, really.
Oh, yeah, definitely. One of the biggest challenges is signal power decay. Basically, the further away the target, the weaker the signal that bounces back. It's like, shouting across a canyon. The further you are, the harder it is to hear the echo.
So how do they deal with that?
Well, they use some pretty sophisticated signal processing techniques, but even then, there are limitations. And another big factor is spatial resolution. This basically refers to how sharp the images are, how much detail you can see.
So like a high-resolution image, you can zoom in and see like individual trees. A low-resolution image, everything's kind of blurry.
Right. And spatial resolution in SAR depends on a few things: the wavelength of the radar, the distance to the target, and most importantly, the size of the antenna on the satellite. The bigger the antenna, the sharper the images.
So it's like the bigger the ear, the better you can hear.
That's a good analogy. And they're really pushing the limits of this technology. But there's another piece to this puzzle: the Fourier transform.
Fourier transform.
Yeah. It sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty fundamental to how SAR works. Think of it like this. The radar sends out these waves, these pulses, right? And the echoes that come back, they're still waves, but they're kind of messy waves. They're all jumbled up.
So how do you turn those messy waves into a picture?
That's where the Fourier transform comes in. It's a mathematical tool that allows you to take a signal, any signal, and break it down into its individual frequencies. It's like taking white light and splitting it into a rainbow.
So you're basically taking those messy waves and turning them into something more organized, something that can be turned into an image.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point they make in the transcript: the difference between the territory and the map of the territory. What SAR creates is a map. It's a representation of the ground based on those radar echoes. But it's not a perfect copy. It's influenced by these mathematical functions, like the Fourier transform.
So like a map can show you the layout of a city, but it can't tell you what it feels like to walk down those streets, smell the food, hear the sounds.
Right. There's always going to be a difference between the representation and the reality.
Okay, so we've got SAR, we've got the Fourier transform. They also mentioned something called inertial SAR or INSAR. What's that all about?
Yeah, so in SAR, it's a really cool technique. It uses the phase differences between multiple radar images to detect tiny, tiny movements in the ground. We're talking like millimeters.
So, like, if the ground shifts even a little bit, INSAR can pick it up.
Exactly. And this has been used to, like, monitor volcanoes, track the movement of glaciers, even detect subtle ground subsidence in cities. But it has a limitation. It can only measure movement in the line of sight of the satellite. So if something's moving sideways, INSAR might miss it.
Okay, so back to the pyramids. They're not just using, like, regular SAR or INSAR, right?
Right. They're doing something way more innovative.
Yeah.
They're exploiting something called the photon-phonon interaction. And this is where it gets really interesting.
Photon-phonon interaction. Break it down for us.
Okay, so photons, those are particles of light or electromagnetic radiation. Phonons, those are essentially vibrations in a material. They're like the sound particles, you could say. And what these researchers have figured out is how to convert photons into phonons.
You're saying they're turning light into sound?
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They're using radar waves, which are a form of electromagnetic radiation, to create vibrations in the ground. And these vibrations, they travel really well underground, especially in dense materials like granite.
Okay, so how does this help them see inside the pyramids?
Well, they're using a combination of techniques. They're analyzing the Doppler effect in the SAR data, which helps them get the sideways dimension of the image. They've also developed something called a sub-aperture Doppler method.
Sub-aperture Doppler.
Yeah. It sounds complicated, but the basic idea is that they intentionally reduce the resolution of the radar data, so they're creating multiple lower resolution images over time. And then by analyzing these images, they can track the movement of pixels in the image.
Tracking the movement of pixels.
Right. And this movement, it's not just random noise.
Yeah.
It's actually correlated with the rotation of the Earth.
Yeah.
And this is their big breakthrough. They're able to show that the movement of these pixels is consistent with the conversion of electromagnetic waves into essentially a phonic signal.
So they're picking up on the vibrations created by the radar, even though those vibrations are, like, super subtle.
Exactly. And they're not just picking up any vibrations. They're specifically looking for vibrations that are consistent with the properties of the material the radar is hitting.
So, like, if the radar hits granite, the vibrations are going to be different than if it hits, like, sand or limestone.
Right. And these vibrations, they create these really faint waves on the surface. And those waves, they're like the fingerprints of what's happening underground. They're evidence that the radar is interacting with something deep below the surface. It's like if you were to drop a pebble in a pond, you can see the ripples spreading out on the surface, even though the pebble is hidden underwater.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So they're basically using radar to create these sound waves underground, and then they're analyzing those waves to figure out what's down there.
That's the gist of it. And they use this great analogy in the transcript, the space turntable analogy. They say, imagine the Earth is like a vinyl record spinning around. And the electromagnetic wave from the radar, it's like the needle on the record player. And the photon-phonon interaction, that's the point of contact, the point where the needle touches the record. And that's where the information is converted from one nature to another.
It's like the radar is reading the music of the Earth.
Exactly. And to prove that this whole thing wasn't just some crazy idea, they did some tests, they were actually able to detect the vibrations on high-voltage cables from space, just by analyzing the radar data.
So they're picking up on the hum of the power lines from orbit.
Yeah, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And this led them to develop these really sophisticated computer algorithms. They call them tomographic inversion algorithms.
Tomographic inversion.
It sounds intimidating, but the basic idea is that these algorithms can take the data from the radar, the faint waves on the surface, and use it to reconstruct a kind of 3D X-ray image of what's underground. It's like putting together a puzzle, but instead of flat pieces, you're working with like sound waves and vibrations.
And they've actually used this technology to image real-world structures, right?
Oh, yeah. They mentioned several case studies in the transcript. They were able to image underground tunnels and laboratories at the Gran Sasso National Laboratory in Italy. They imaged the interior of the Mosul Dam in Iraq, and they even imaged the Gotthard Base Tunnel, which is this huge railway tunnel that runs under the Swiss Alps.
So they're not just, like, theorizing about this. They're actually putting it into practice.
Right. And their method, it's so innovative that they've actually got a patent for it in Malta.
A patent. So this is the real deal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this brings us to their analysis of the Pyramid of Khafre. Remember, their initial goal was to scan under the Sphinx, but they shifted their focus to Khafre because they believe there might be structures there that are linked to Thoth.
Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom and writing.
Right. And they start by reviewing what we know about the Great Pyramid, the internal structure, the chambers, the passages. And they emphasize the potential vibrational function of the Great Pyramid, the idea that it was designed to resonate with certain frequencies.
And Khafre?
Well, Khafre's a bit of a mystery. I mean, conventionally, it's considered to be mostly empty, just two small chambers and some corridors at ground level. And the researchers, they're like, why would the ancient Egyptians go through all that trouble to build this massive structure if there wasn't something significant inside?
It doesn't make sense, does it?
Bro.
So they decided to use their new radar technique to, as they put it, photograph the sound inside Khafre.
And this is where things get really, really interesting. Because remember those satellite radar images we were talking about? The ones that are distorted because of the angle of the antenna? Well, those distortions, they carry over into the tomographies, the 3D images they create from the radar data.
So it's like trying to read a map that's been, crumpled up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when they first started analyzing the tomographies of Khafre, they were stumped. It was hard to make sense of the data. But as they kept working at it, they started to notice these unusual colored tubes descending and ascending within the pyramid.
Tubes?
Yeah, like cylindrical shapes. And each pixel in these images, it contains information from the entire slice they're looking at. And the color of the pixel, it represents the frequency of the vibration at that point.
So it's like a heat map of the vibrations inside the pyramid.
Exactly. And to try to make sense of all this, they started using various processing techniques. They were trying to enhance the differences between the colors, highlight specific vibrations, anything to, tease out the structures hidden within the data.
And they even mentioned something called the trippa effect. What's that all about?
Okay, so trippa is the Italian word for tripe. And visually, it refers to, the folds and wrinkles of something.
Yeah.
In this context, the trippa effect is a technique where they intentionally stretch or squeeze the image without altering the underlying data. It's like taking a wrinkled piece of paper and smoothing it out so you can read what's written on it.
So they're basically manipulating the image to see if they can reveal any hidden details?
Exactly. And as they kept working with the data, they started to see something really strange, this descending structure that looked like a cannon.
A cannon inside the pyramid.
Yeah, I know. It sounds crazy. And at first they thought it was just a reflection, like a ghost in the data. But then they did something really clever. They started looking at the tomographies from multiple different angles.
So taking multiple X-rays of the same object from different directions.
Right. And what they realized was that what they initially thought was one single structure, it was actually multiple distinct structures. Instead of one cannon, they were seeing 4 or 5 separate descending elements.
So it was like the perspective was tricking them.
Exactly. And as they continued to analyze the data using this trippa effect, they started to see these colored smudges in the upper section of the pyramid. And these smudges, they suggested that there were even more structures hidden beneath the surface.
It's like they're peeling back layers of an onion.
Right. And to make things even clearer, they started stacking multiple images on top of each other. This helps to reduce noise and enhance the signal so the structures stand out more.
It's like taking multiple photos of the same thing and then merging them together to get a super sharp image.
Yeah. And then they started doing something really interesting. They started taking these horizontal slices of the pyramid tomography. So instead of looking at it from the side, they were looking at it from above, as if they were slicing through the pyramid at different elevations.
Like cutting a loaf of bread into slices.
Right. And these horizontal slices, they revealed some interesting things. They started to see these luminous spots, these bright areas scattered throughout the pyramid.
Luminous spots.
Yeah. And they also discovered this really interesting artifact, this phononic reverberation.